Welcome to American University. We are very pleased to be hosting this event, especially because this is actually the beginning of AU's Family Weekend. And so in addition to noted faculty, some of our important collaborators, a extremely well-respected academic, we also have some parents in the audience. And so that's, for us, extremely fun. My name is Piper Campbell. I am the chair of the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security here at the School of International Service. And the School of International Service, the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security, is very pleased to be partnering with two institutions to bring Dr. Dresser here today. The first of those two institutions is the Woodrow Wilson Center, Woodrow Wilson Center, Mexico Institute. And the second of the two institutions with which we are partnering is American University's own Latin Studies and Latin America and Latin Studies. And so I am going to introduce now Andrew Rudman from the Wilson Center, who will explain a bit about why all three of our organizations are pleased to be co-hosting this event.
You in the back, they're standing up. There's some chairs here.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to be brief because I know we're all anxious to hear Dr. Dresser. My name is Andrew Rudman. I'm the director of the Mexico Institute at the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is a congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, fiercely independent and nonpartisan think tank. And what we really try to do is bring together diverse points of view, diverse perspectives to address complicated policy issues around the world. In the case of the Mexico Institute, focused primarily, really specifically on Mexico and on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. And as you all know, the number of issues that impact the relationship and that impact Mexico are more than we could cover probably this morning, or certainly more than we can cover in the Mexico Institute. But it really is a great pleasure to partner, to be here and to partner with AU, with both departments at AU, and we're really, again, looking forward to this presentation. So thanks all for being here, and those of you who are watching online as well.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. Welcome again to American University. I'm happy to join my colleagues in giving you a welcome and welcoming Denise. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here speaking to us. I'm Ernesto Castañeda, an associate professor of sociology and also the director of the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. It's a center that has been at AU for 13 years, and we do research, policy recommendations, engage with the media on issues affecting all Latin America and Latinos in the United States. So we're happy to also sponsor events like that. And you're on the mailing list, let me know. We have like 6 other events happening this month around Latinos, Latin America, immigration issues. And we're also interested in what's happening in Mexico. So welcome. And now the formal introduction from Ambassador Wayne.
Thanks everybody for being here. It's a great pleasure to see so many friends in the audience, so many specialists on Mexico, but indicates how much respect Dr. Dresser has in Washington as he does in Mexico City and many other places. I have the pleasure of teaching here at SIS, thus I'm also being associated with the Center for Latin America and being the co-chair of the board of the Mexico Institute. So I get to help cross-fertilize all these three wonderful institutions. And the wonderful special gift we have today is having Dr. Denise Dresser with us. She is a renowned political analyst, a respected and widely listened to columnist, and a respected academic who's been teaching at Eton in Mexico City since 1991. And I invite you to look online at her CV and bio to see the long list of many things she's done. But today we're especially going to focus on the very insightful analysis that she's done for a long time, but especially in recent years, about the threats to democracy in Mexico. And as you all know, both of our countries are facing challenges to our democracy. both of our countries are integrally linked together. And as I often say, there's no other country in the world that touches the daily lives of more Americans than Mexico. So it's wonderful that you're all here to hear the insights and wisdom of Denise Dresser, and I turn it over to you, and we'll have some Q&A after her remarks. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's such a joy to see so many familiar faces that have influenced my own thinking about my country. And thank you, Ambassador Wayne, when I reached out and asked if I could give a talk, and you and your team and everyone else so willingly accepted and made this happen. I truly appreciate it. If you read my CV, there may be a long list of academic accomplishments, of conferences or whatever, but I want to start off by saying that first, I am a Democrat with a small d, and I am an activist. And the reason I begin my talk by saying this is because I want to start off with an anecdote that I think exemplifies what's happening in Mexico today. So exactly almost a year ago, October 2nd, which is the day where Mexicans look back at what happened on October 2nd in 1968. There is usually a big march, students participate, activists participate, members of civil society participate, and I have been marching on October 2nd as long as I can remember. And it seemed especially important to march last October 2nd because of the way in which the Mexican military has become empowered over the last 3 administrations, but particularly over the last 5 years. So there I was. The march started in the buildings of Tlatelolco. I was marching with the people who I've usually marched with, Amnesty International, women's collectives, the Mothers of the Disappeared, Article 19, and it takes almost half an hour to get from the buildings of Tlatelolco to the Zócalo. And we were carrying a huge banner, 104 meters of a banner that read, "No to impunity, no to militarization." If you follow Mexico closely, you will remember that this banner was hung from the Estela de Luz in an unprecedented act of activism by a friend of mine who actually climbed the Estela de Luz without the government's permission with this banner on her back and then unfurled it to the displeasure of the government and the Mexico City police. Anyway, we were carrying this banner. We reached the Zócalo. We start putting the banner on the floor, on the plancha del Zócalo. And suddenly I see a group of young people who are starting to yell, "Fifi, representative of the oligarchy, it's your fault that Mexico was an authoritarian country, priista, salinista, you're an enemy of the people. Prensa vendida, you're part of the mafia in power." And I was looking at them and thinking, what is happening here? And why in my 30 years of marching has this not happened before? And there reached a point in which these young men and women, no more than 50, were becoming increasingly aggressive. And they were yelling, "Fuera Dresser, fuera Dresser." And the women who were protecting me, who linked arms with me and were telling them to stay away, to push back, because things were starting to become more and more heated, were the women's collectives, the Mothers of the Disappeared. So ultimately, they me acuerparon, which is they defended me with their bodies, and they said, "Denise, you should leave. We should take you out before this becomes worse." So they led me out, and At one point, I had tried to stand in front of this group and debate, but they wouldn't even let me speak because they were yelling so loudly. And there were cameras all around me. This became a media event. And at one point, as we almost left the Zócalo, I started to cry. And I didn't leave because I'm a coward. And I think those who know me or have known me for years would never use, you could use other derogatory words to characterize me, but I don't think coward would be one of them. I didn't cry because I was scared. I cried because of what this represented. An activist of the left was made a career writing, criticizing every government and trying to, I mean, I had been in the Zócalo so many times before. After the fraud of Carlos Salinas, marching so that we have an autonomous electoral authority in the 90s, being a member of Alianza Cívica and doing observation for the first free election we had in 1994. In the Zócalo, the night that Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas won and celebrating the first electoral victory of the left. Then year 2000, being in the Zócalo when we celebrated not Fox's victory, but getting the PRI out of office. And to think that, just think of the paradoxes here. Someone with that career and that trajectory is kicked out of the Zócalo by supporters of a government that has militarized the country and that is forcing someone out of a public space for marching against militarization and is protected by the mothers of the 113,000 people in Mexico who are officially listed as disappeared. So I was crying because of that. And why did they attack me? I mean, I'm not that well known. I've never held public office. You know, I may be on TV occasionally, radio. The reason they attacked me is because President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, in the same way that Trump governed via Twitter, López Obrador has governed via the morning press conference. And this he uses as a bully pulpit to tell members of his government what they're supposed to do. So if you're a member of the cabinet, you have to watch the mañanera so that you know what the government is instructing you to do. He also lambastes the opposition for being conservative, corrupt, for having saqueado, how do you say saqueado in English? Eluded the country. And he goes after members of civil society. He goes after members of the media constantly. And he has mentioned me specifically by name, La Señora Dresser. And not that I want to be called Dr. Dresser, no soy tan mamona, but he doesn't refer to men as El Señor Zuckerman or El Señor Loret de Mola. Here, saying señora has a very specific connotation. Señora in Mexico means you should be at home baking cookies instead of participating in the public debate. He's mentioned me 107 times. And we've counted this because I'm litigating against the morning press conference. And in this, he said what he usually says about the media. You've been bought off, you're a conservative, you're against the people, you're an enemy of the people, you don't want to change Mexico, you want to conserve your privileges, past governments paid you off, I'm not paying you off anymore, and so you missed that. But the worst thing he said, and this is the reason why I'm litigating against him, is he said that I was an American spy. He said that because I had been to a breakfast at the US Embassy in 2006, and I had spoken to embassy staff in the same way that I've been to probably dozens of breakfasts at other embassies in the same way that many academics do. When WikiLeaks happened, my name appeared there. So suddenly I was an agent of the CIA, I was a spy, I was aiding and abetting a foreign government. So he can have an opinion about me. He cannot or should not defame me. And this is what has been going on in the morning press conference. And I think that those contradictions that I exhibited in my anecdote of the Zócalo and what's happening in the morning press conference are warning signs of what has been happening to Mexican democracy. I entitled this talk, "Is Mexico's Democracy Dying?" in order to be provocative. I would not say today that it is dead. I would say that it is under serious threat. It is at risk. And I started to notice this. I mean, full disclosure, I voted for Andrés Manuel López Obrador. If I said this in Mexico, people would probably at this point start throwing things at me. But I voted for him because I was of a generation that believed that we had gone through a transition to democracy, in many ways successful at the electoral level because we got alternancia. But there are many things that had gone awry that needed to be fixed, and that we needed like a second stage that dealt with inequality issues, that dealt with the fact that we had a permanent subclass, that Mexico needed to be shaken up. However, what I started to notice from day one, and this became even more evident in my classes, that we no longer spoke about the Mexican political system, about as had been the case over the past 20 years that I've been teaching. We didn't talk about Congress or the Supreme Court, checks and balances, the role of the media. We talked incessantly about Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Because in order to understand the country, we had to try and get into the president's head. And this is exactly the way in which I was teaching in the 1980s, when Mexico had an imperial, omnipotent, omnipresent president. And if you remember the famous phrase that Luis Echeverría, the president from the 1970s, coined, en este país no se mueve una hoja sin que lo sepa el presidente. In this country, not a leaf moves without the president knowing about it or ordering that leaf to move. It seemed to me that the mere fact that I was teaching this way and that we were focusing our attention on this president and that the country was being run that way was a threat to democracy. And then secondly, I also teach a comparative politics class. And there is a burgeoning literature now on democratic backsliding, on democratic erosion. So reading that literature, books like Ziblatt and Levitsky, How Democracies Die, Anne Applebaum's Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, Haggard and Kaufman on democratic backsliding, the special issue of the Journal of Democracy on democratic backsliding. I mean, I could continue to quote many books, Adam Przeworski, Crises of Democracy. And what this literature on backsliding pointed out is that democracy is under serious threat in many places in the world, not just Mexico. What was so fascinating about How Democracies Die is that for the first time, the United States was included in a comparative analysis as a democracy under threat. And Ziblatt and Levitsky have like a checklist of warning signs. And as time went by under the López Obrador administration, I started checking off each one of the boxes. And the commonality that runs through these cases that have specific national context, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, the Philippines, Venezuela, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and to a certain extent, Mexico, is that democracy is no longer under threat. Well, in some places it is, but in many other places, it's not under threat by military coups, it's not dying at because there are pistols pointed to the head of the government. in the cases of democratic backsliding that we're witnessing today, it's democratically elected leaders that, once elected, use their power, their legitimacy, to their office and the institutions of democracy that help them get there to actually dismantle democracy, concentrate power, the literature calls it executive aggrandizement, concentrate power in themselves, and dismantle checks and balances with the very seductive argument of combating poverty, combating corruption, enacting transformational change. And what I've written about, marched about, have a book coming out on this issue, is that this is happening in Mexico. And it's been happening now for 5 years. And it's very hard to fight this because at times it's gradual. The goalposts keep moving. I remember a meeting of the Citizens Collective I'm part of, Seguridad Sin Guerra, 4 years ago, where we have to defend the Human Rights Commission. If they take that, if the government controls that, that's the end of it. Well, the government took control of the Human Rights Commission, and now the goalposts move. Today, we're 2 months ago, 3 months ago, it's we have to defend the National Electoral Institute. And now it's we have to defend the Supreme Court. Every couple of months, there's a new institution under threat. And you're not going to hear in this talk a defense of the past. You're not going to hear me say Mexico is Switzerland. What's the problem? I mean, why does he want to reform democracy if it was so great? No, because it wasn't. For many people, democracy, electoral democracy, did not bring what it was supposed to bring. And this is not specific to Mexico either. There's a critique of liberal democracy happening throughout the world. Democracy failing to deliver to the people, failing to address the issue of inequality, creating a huge gap between elites and those who feel dispossessed, marginalized, left behind. So this is happening. And some of the characteristics that I saw in other places were what we were living in where I was born, the same polarization created by the leader in power. And I'm not saying that Mexico was not a polarized place by race or class, because clearly it was, but we never had a president who used polarization as a way of governing, who explicitly resorted to the rhetoric of the people versus the traitors to democracy, the people versus the rapacious elites, the people versus that fictitious democracy that existed in the past. That was just a simulation. Democracy happened, according to López Obrador, the day he got elected. But for those of us who have memory and who were in the street, no, I mean, just like basic memory, for those of us who were in the streets starting in the 1980s, this constituted a complete obliteration and rewriting of the history of the Mexican transition. And of course, after Fox was elected and in the intervening years between 2000 and 2018, there are many things that went awry, and we can discuss them ad nauseum. How institutions became captured, how partidocracia emerged, how elites rotated in power, but representation was not fully addressed, how inequality remained untouched, how corruption and crony capitalism remained largely untouched. But because that happened, and because our democracy was imperfect and deficient for many, in many ways, this created a fertile ground for someone like López Obrador to be elected, and to be elected in a landslide with 30 million votes. And it's given him the narrative legitimacy to say, let's do away with those institutions. They never worked anyway. Those were the institutions of the elite. Those were the institutions of the neoliberal era. So the dysfunctionality of Mexico's democracy and the dysfunctionality created by our very top-heavy, oligopolistic, crony capitalist economic system, this created someone like Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So hay una paternidad responsable that both the PAN and the PRI should have assumed, and to this day have not. So there's a cause and there is an effect. And many of us voted for AMLO thinking his diagnosis is correct. So we expected that the solution would be the correct solution. And I think that's what's been the most shocking thing, to see the disjuncture between the absolutely correct diagnosis and the absolutely incorrect remedies to the problems. Because many of those problems, institutional, economic, social, violence, etc., instead of being corrected by strengthening institutions, by assuring their autonomy, by carrying out social programs that actually worked, instead of alleviating those problems, this presidency and this government have exacerbated them. And you'll ask me, well, but why is he so popular? He is personally popular because he has the bully pulpit. He has his own TV station. I always say that the fourth transformation isn't really a government, it's a narrative. And it's a very successful narrative delivered by a wily, extremely charismatic politician who is tied to his constituency, not by his results, because the polls show that his government is a failure in terms of public evaluation on key issues such as economic management, combating corruption, insecurity. But people love Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And why do they love him? My forthcoming book is imbued by my conversations at length with Anne Applebaum because of the book she wrote on the seductive lure of authoritarianism, where she talks about that many friends, colleagues, people that would have been there marching with me on October 2nd no longer march with me because they're now defending militarization. They're just calling it pacification. They're now on the other side, and they're saying they have bought into the narrative that entails a re-signifying of keywords. Democracy no longer means what Montesquieu or John Stuart Mill or the founding fathers or even the Mexican Constitution entailed it to mean. It means consultas populares. It means the will of the people embodied in the person of the president. Checks and balances are those things that the elites defended that are bad for the people. Civil society, let's do away with that. It's controlled by foreign interests, by private interests, by American interests. So suddenly the country and many of my former friends and colleagues who would have been on the same side if they had remained consistent and would have fought for the same things have now learned how to conjugate a new language. I call it AMLOañol, where it's another form of Español, but it's AMLOañol. And what it's the re-signifying of the key concepts by which we understand the political reality of the country. Many of those people who are in his cabinet have succumbed to the lure of authoritarianism under a very sophisticated disguise. And the disguise is alleviating poverty, doing things for the poor, governing in the name of the people, and combating corruption, and regaining national sovereignty over especially energy issues. And because this is portrayed as the cause, the fourth transformation, it's una epopeya. It's not merely how do we consolidate democracy? How do we carry out institutional reforms? How do we do like the nitty gritty of governing? It's attached yourself to a heroic transformational cause, which now leads many people to this position in which the ends justify the means. So even if we have to resort to anti-democratic means, let's legitimize and validate them because we're working in the name of the people. And so everything that my generation fought for, which was incipient checks and balances, government accountability, combating corruption, rule of law, fair and free elections, all of those things that are now under threat. On the other side, they're being portrayed as this is necessary to carry out the will of the people. For those who have memory, this has a clear element of deja vu, of, oh my God, I've lived this before. My students, of course, have no idea. They don't know what life under authoritarianism and the imperial presidency was like. They don't know what it was like before there was an autonomous INE. They think that Mexico's always had a credencial de elector. And what would be the problem if the government ran the elections? It would be cheaper. And now we have to have Republican austerity. So the government is going to run the elections and it's going to create its own ID for you. And why should we even spend on indelible ink? Those things that my students take for granted that are now under risk. So AMLO is destroying much of what we attempted to build. And I reiterate, I'm not saying that we built Denmark. I'm not saying that we built Switzerland. We did build kind of the foundations of democratic rule that if you look at the history of Mexico, it's been rather short-lived. You know, began kind of in the late 80s, blossomed in the 90s with alternancia and the blue wave of the National Action Party, then alternancia at the level of the presidency, and then 18 years of that. And then suddenly you have a government that's saying the National Electoral Institute is too expensive. Our adversaries have taken control of it. We have to clean it up. We have to reduce our spending. Its councillors should be elected. And what's the problem with the government running elections? And this goes for basically every institution that we attempted to build. So his rhetoric, his policy decisions have put those incipient democratic norms and institutions at risk. What happened after he said we're changing the INE? Well, at this point, many Mexicans actually did believe that some, at least, those of us who went out and marched in 2 significant marches across the country, said, no, we have to defend this because it's ours, because we run elections. And if those of you who are familiar with the electoral process in Mexico know that citizens there's an algorithm by which you get chosen to be at a casilla, and then you count the votes and so on. So we managed to stop that assault on the INE, but then what happened? If the pattern is, if you can't destroy it, then you colonize it. So there was a renewal of the General Council, and now you have an INE that is much weaker, that is much more deferential to the president. The INE instructed the president to stop attacking the opposition in the morning press conference and to stop saying many things in favor of his chosen candidate, because for those of us who have memory, why was that imperative back then and today? Because we come from a presidentialist system. And the words of the president are not the words of anyone. And we have a very restrictive electoral law precisely because for many years, the opposition competed in elections where it could never win. So by doing this in the morning press conference, the president is altering the level playing field. So the INE, for example, said, stop attacking the opposition. And the president said, you're restricting my freedom of speech. And the INE said, well, if you're not going to stop attacking the opposition, at least run a little banner every morning that says, this is government propaganda. So he did obey that. But then after that, he runs a little banner on his YouTube channel and on every public station in the country that transmits the Mañanera. And his banner says, if you are a conservative, privileged member of the elite, do not watch this program because it's not meant for you. So, and there's so many instances in which I could exemplify his defiance of the electoral authority. The same has happened with the National Transparency Institute that he tried to dismantle and has not named the full board. He says that it's too expensive. Why do people need transparency? This government is transparent. Trust me, we're transparent. Why do you need this institution? Then the same is happening with all of the regulatory bodies. The president doesn't believe in regulation. And for those of us who have been fighting crony capitalism for years, I mean, I'm known here, I'm sure, among many of you for my public, very public debates with Carlos Slim and what I've written. So why did we try to build regulatory agencies in the 90s and the 2000s? Because regulation leads to level playing field capitalism, because the only way you rein in the oligarchs is with robust regulation, a competition commission, an energy commission, a telecoms commission. The president has said, those don't work. If things need to be corrected, they should come and talk to me, which is what used to happen in the 1980s. And that's why we still have crony capitalism. And that's why when the president does his tour of the Maya train, who sits with him? Carlos Slim, who continues to extract rents in the same way that everyone else does, because now the regulators are deeply divided, weakened, huge budget cuts. So the autonomy, he's taken over those autonomous institutions that were created precisely to take away discretionality from economic transactions. And now the target is the Supreme Court. Why? Because insofar as this president, as many others, Orban, Erdogan, this isn't even specifically a Mexican phenomenon. They govern jumping over administrative rules. They govern distrusting the bureaucracy. They pass rules without, they pass laws in Congress without obeying the necessary rules on how you pass a law. So the Supreme Court has now been flooded with actions of inconstitutionality. And on autonomous, Supreme Court has become like the last defense, striking down law after law that was passed badly, created badly, or that is going to have an effect that goes against the Constitution. So what is the president saying now? Supreme Court is elitist, it's privileged, we're paying for their holidays and their yoga classes. And so now vote for Morena in the 2024 election, because our main campaign issue is going to be that the ministers of the court are elected by the popular vote, because otherwise the Supreme Court does not reflect the will of the people. I assume that many of you are versed in constitutional law and understand what a Supreme Court does, and its job is not to defend the will of the people. Well, it does insofar as its job is to defend the Constitution, and the will of the people is expressed in the Constitution, not in the interpretation of the will of the people done by one man. So what are the results of this? Huge personal popularity, because the narrative is very seductive. And the narrative of the defense of democracy is not at all sexy or seductive. It's dry, it's technical. For many Mexicans, it's like, why are you defending democracy if it never really worked? Why are you defending those institutions that were at times colonized or catered to the wealthy or the privileged? Because they often did. So for those of us in the same place, demanding the same things that we demanded in 1988 and in 1994 and in 2000 and 2006 and 2012 and 2018, the defense of the system is very difficult in the face of this president, who also has the bully pulpit and who every day says, oh, you're trying to defend the Transparency Institute. You're a traitor to the people. You're defending the privileges of those people who don't, transparency, what do we need to be spending on that institution for? So huge personal popularity accompanied by growing insecurity, because there's an aspect I haven't touched on, but is fundamental to understand why Mexico's democracy is under threat. It's not only the weakening of these institutions and the concentration of power in one man and the narrative, it has to do with the militarization of the country. And many people do not pay enough attention to this. The Citizens Collective that I'm part of has created something called El Índice Nacional de lo Militarizado. It's an index of things that used to be under civilian control that are now run by the military. So the list now has over 246 activities. Airports, ports, immigration, distribution of vaccines, running of banks, 240 activities. Mexico City Airport was recently given to the Mexican military. The construction of the Maya train, the construction of Dos Bocas, the construction of the new airport. And by the way, all of these huge projects of infrastructure have been classified as of national security because the military is involved, which means we have no access to the contracts, the planning, whether things were done according to norms. So what this president has done, because he mistrusts the institutions and wants to create a loyal force of his own, is essentially co-govern with the Mexican military. Resources, access to the budget, complete protection for attacks regarding corruption, Guacamaya leaks, Sedena leaks, everything that leaks the knowledge that the military had of attacks in Ayotzinapa or in other places, or ties between government officials and drug traffickers. López Obrador protects the military. So you now have a poder fáctico, unelected, without any sort of civilian control or oversight, loyal to the president and loyal to his movement and loyal not to the Mexican state, but to the party. So this is what we're facing in the 2024 election in June. A president who handpicked his successor. Many of you will say, oh, no, there was like a primary and they kind of went around the country. They couldn't really debate. They could just, say how great AMLO was. But at the end, there was this poll, and the poll said that it was Claudia. Let's please be honest about this. A friend of mine calls this a plebiscitary dedazo, and I think he was completely correct. So he had been constructing her candidacy for over a year. You have an opposition that united around a candidate who has quick reflexes, has some charm, has an interesting personal background, but is associated with two very discredited parties that every day the president reminds the people of how badly they governed and also invents things about them. And the negatives of those parties are still very high. And so we're facing what is called una elección de Estado. Anne Applebaum wrote a recent piece on how elections in Poland this Sunday are probably not going to be either free or fair because of the capture of the state that has already been taking place over the last years, and how the ruling party is now the government in the same way that the PRI was the government, el muégano again, which means that the ruling party has access to an incredible amount of resources. And the playing field is no longer level. You have a weakened electoral authority, and you have a president that has just announced for the 2024 budget a huge increase in debt, because that debt is going to go to first finish the Maya train, but also to the social programs. And we can argue here how many of the social programs in Mexico are true government responsiveness and how many of them are electoral clientelism. But given the state of affairs, it is very hard for the opposition, even if they had the best, most attractive, charismatic candidate in a unified electoral front, that opposition will still face an election in which the party is the state. And to finish up, I will say one final reflection, and this is the final paragraph in a piece I wrote recently for Foreign Affairs that says democracy relies on rules, on procedures, on institutions. In Mexico today, those rules, those procedures, and those institutions are ceasing to exist or are under serious threat. And it's impossible to debate this in a rational fashion because identity politics have become the norm. It's an us versus them. It's a climate of division, polarization, resentment that makes it very hard to have a rational debate or a rational form of deliberation on any sort of public policy, because it doesn't matter what you argue, it's who the government says you are. And I finish by saying that because I was defamed in the morning press conference, I took the president to court. Ai Weiwei, the famous Chinese dissident, says that you need to use the institutions of the state to understand whether they work for the citizen or if they don't. So in its first instance, the judge disappeared, the judge of the court where my amparo was processed, disappeared for 3 months, never reappeared, said she was sick. Then the Secretaria en Funciones, #2, came out with a written statement saying that I had no right to ask for an amparo because the morning press conference is not an act of authority, and you can only ask for a stay in light of an act of authority. And I'm thinking, well, if it's not an act of authority, why is everyone following the instructions that the president gives in the morning press conference? And plus, I'm paying for it with my taxes. Of course, it's an act of authority. So I'm now in a second instance that is going to rule in the next 2 weeks. And all it would entail is that the president stop defaming me. He can say, she's fat, she's ugly. Those are opinions. He cannot defame me or any other member of the opposition, the press, civil society. And the idea when I decided to do this, accompanied by 2 incredible young women lawyers, is even if we fail, even if this ultimately goes to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission because it could end up there. I want it to be there on the record that somebody said no, that somebody said this is not right, that somebody said this is not democratic, that somebody said this is not what I expected when I voted for you, and that somebody said we will continue to fight for democracy. You will leave next summer, and we will still be here. Thank you very much.
We need to repeat the questions if they're asked from the out in the audience to be heard.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes,
So we'll have to repeat the question. All right. Please, everybody. In the back.
Dr. Dresser, thank you very much for your very, very interesting conversation. I have two very great questions. Actually, one. Sorry. What are the chances that Claudia Sheinbaum, assuming you win the election next year, one, to decouple from the substance of the core transformation, maybe that you want to decouple from the very strong influence of AMLO? And secondly, what are the risks of a military coup in Mexico if she or anybody else wants to take down the purge that they have been given?
So I've been asked, can Claudia really decouple from AMLO? And whether the military is a force that could operate or try to push a golpe de Estado, a military coup, if she were to try to rein them in. Claudia Sheinbaum is in a very tough position because in order for her to win, the election has to be a referendum on López Obrador because it's so popular. And I think that's the way he's trying to frame it. La continuidad de la cuarta transformación. So she has to say that she's just going to continue doing what he's doing. And she says, well, it'll be continuity with change. I'm going to build the segundo piso de la transformación. And I was thinking last night, you know, Claudia, maybe you should stay away from building metaphors, given the línea 12. But she says the segundo piso, right?
Which is a reference to the metro system in
That
Mexico
collapsed,
City where part of
killing-
it fell down.
Killing 29 people under her watch. So nobody really knows what the segundo piso de la transformación means, or what the change would be along with the continuity. She has emphasized, well, I'm a scientist. She can't delink without criticizing him. What is she going to say? Oh, I'm going to, make policy decisions on the basis of evidence. Well, that would suggest that her predecessor has made decisions on the basis of gut feeling, which has been the case, and not evidence. Or when she says, I'm a scientist, well, what does that mean? If you look at the way in which Mexico handled COVID, and the fact that Claudia's government gave out ivermectin in kits to people in Mexico City as on an experimental basis without asking for their consent, I think sheds a large amount of doubt over her scientist allure. Plus the fact that she completely backs the, what I call el petronacionalismo, petronationalism, this Pemex great again, public resources being funneled to it, the construction of another refinery. In the plan of government of the next stage of the transformation, if you read it, it says we're planning another refinery. Well, considering what's happening to the planet and considering what's happened to Mexico, it's not clear to me that her scientific background will operate in any significant way, because that would entail going against López Obrador, and he has already tied her. And I do this to my students, and I want to do it now because I think it's a visual metaphor. So she's like this. Tiene las manos atadas by three cords. One of them is the military. The other is the budget. And the third is the revocación del mandato, the recall, where if he is displeased with how she's governing, he can rally his rank and file and say, that's your constitutional right to ask for a recall halfway through her term. Regarding the military, that's the question for her, and for whoever is elected, I think in all likelihood it will be her. This is unprecedented for Mexico. We escaped the dirty wars of Argentina, Chile, elsewhere, because one of the good things that the PRI did was to have a very small military under civilian control and dedicated basically to relief services, etc. Now you've created a 250,000 person force that has tentacles in the key areas of management of the economy. Imagine ports, transportation, immigration, airports. How long did it take countries like Chile, Argentina, Brazil to return the military to the barracks? A generation? Sadly, that's how long I think it will take us. Also, the military is very popular because the police were corrupt. See, that's another, it's like a resignificación. You know, militarization is now called pacification in my country. And the military is popular because of course people haven't had much interaction with the military. They have a bad opinion with the police because they have interacted with the police. What assurances do we have that the Mexican military, without civilian control, is going to operate in transparent ways? They don't have the training to do policing, which is now what they're going to do, which is arrest suspects and take them to the Ministerio Público and so on. So imagine the implications of this for the long run. And given just how fundamental they are and how much of the Mexican state has been dismantled, Claudia can't govern without them.
Leila.
Hi, Denise. It's such a pleasure and honor to have you here in Washington, D.C. I hear you speak, and I have a question about looking forward, right? How to strengthen Mexico's democracy instead of focusing on the AMLO administration, which I agree has destroyed a lot of the democratic institutions, not in principle. In 2014, there was a political reform that included the coalition government, right? This is opposite to AMLO. We've had presidents in the recent past in Mexico that are a double minority, right? They didn't have more than 50% of the popular vote and didn't necessarily have a majority in Congress with the party that they represented. Do you think that is the Frente Amplio por Mexico, who many analysts, are saying are not necessarily playing for the presidency, they're playing for control of Congress.
Right.
Do you think that they would enact a coalition government in an effort to safeguard democracy in Mexico and actually have a checks and balances? Or do you not?
But well, that's assuming that they could win.
Exactly.
And at this point, Claudia is ahead of Xochitl by what, 30 points? The election hasn't started formally, although for López Obrador, it started the day after he won his election. He's been campaigning for 5 years, and Claudia has already started illegally, by the way, campaigning a year ago. But the formal campaigns don't start until I think January. Right? So there's still a lot of time left. But as I said, I think it's going to be a very hard scenario for the opposition to win. I think they can only do so if they present her as more of a citizen candidate versus one linked to the party bureaucracies, because the brands of both parties at this point have been, are so disreputable. I think the front's main chances and where it should focus a lot of its energy and its attention
is on Congress. Because one of the reasons that López Obrador was able to become so powerful and pass so many laws so quickly in the first 3 years is because the three elements that Jeff Weldon explains, that explain why Mexico had imperial presidents, the three political and institutional factors that gave people like Echeverría, López Portillo, even Carlos Salinas so much power is a presidential system. Second, when you have a majority in Congress, so you don't have a divided government, and 30 million votes gave López Obrador a constitutional majority. And the third is that the president is seen as the leader of his party. Those conditions persisted up until the midterm. And so why is López Obrador turning the Supreme Court into the bête noire of this election? Because it's a way of rallying people against a specific institution of privilege. And people don't understand. They don't understand how the judiciary works. They don't understand that the 2 years it took for their divorce proceeding or a custody battle, and the final decision was not Norma Piña, the president of the court, whose effigy has been burned in the Zócalo. If you really wanted to reform the justice system in Mexico, you would do other things, oral trials, budget to create the infrastructure for oral trials. You do away with la prisión preventiva oficiosa that has led so many poor people to end up in jail. But he's rallying people behind the destruction of the court because he's discovered that that's a very emotional issue, because people don't believe that the justice system works for them. And they think it doesn't work for me because Norma Piña is getting yoga lessons. And he's saying, we need your vote, people of Morena, my base, so that we have a constitutional majority, because that's the only way in which we can destroy the court. So if you don't win the presidency, where do you focus your attention? The local congresses, the national congresses, the governorships that are up for grabs. Because remember, Morena governors are now going to be there are elections in their states. And what we saw in the last midterm is that there is a very strong anti-incumbent sentiment. So it's not guaranteed that the Morena governors will get reelected if the opposition actually has good candidates. It's a huge election. We're talking about 500 members of Congress, the renewal of the Senate, municipalities, local congresses. So the opposition has to be very smart about who it feels, how it presents its candidate, what the narrative is, and they're still not there.
So let's take a question here, then over here, and then we'll go in the back.
Hi, buenos días. Good morning. My name is Roger Reyes. I'm in the first year of the Intercultural and International Communications program here at SIS. My question comes from a public diplomacy perspective. I hope to become a future public diplomacy practitioner myself. And I remember back in the day when I had Facebook, there was a meme that was shared among many Latin Americans, which said something along the lines of "La corrupción es peor que una bomba atómica," which for my non-speaking, Spanish-speaking people, is basically a corruption is worse than an atomic bomb. And they would often draw parallels between Japan's development and what we see in Central America and other countries that are also still under development. My question for you is, how do you communicate the fact that backsliding democratically affects the average citizen? Because I find that sometimes in our discourses, especially as academics, our language often gatekeeps people from understanding the importance of democracy. So how can you communicate that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the things I've realized over the past 5 years, when I saw how faltering the defense of democracy was, how seductive the lure of authoritarianism was, precisely this issue. One of the things we failed at over the past 30 years was educating people about their rights, educating them about what it entails to be a citizen, educating them as to what the INE does, what the Supreme Court does, what the INAI does, what the regulators do. And because porque faltó pedagogía pública, and people don't really have an understanding of how the government works. A very simplistic narrative of the elites versus the people, the bad guys versus us, the complexity of the democratic system or why checks and balances are important is difficult to communicate, especially when you have the most able communicator in the country every day for 3 hours explaining the country to his base. And he said from day one, we're combating corruption. So vote for me to dismantle the court because that's a way of combating corruption. Support the fourth transformation because the people who looted Mexico will never come back. And that's a way of combating corruption. Now, the bottom line is that when you don't have an effective judiciary, you don't have a national anti-corruption system, you don't have an independent prosecutor. Even, in other words, the president said corruption will diminish in Mexico because I am going to sweep the steps. I'm going to give instructions to everyone that they should not be corrupt. Be good. And what I've responded in every way, shape, and form is in order to sweep the stairs, you actually need a broom. And the broom is institutions. And so if you remember in the last part of the Peña Nieto government, civil society had created what is called a national anti-corruption system. Very sophisticated, very elaborate, perhaps too elaborate, but with a series of checks and balances. For the first time, things like conflict of interest were codified as corruption. Things that had never been sanctioned were to be sanctioned. But of course, you needed to, it was left as a legacy for López Obrador, and he took a look at it and he said, oh, I don't want this. And so he defunded this, he never got it going. And now the cases of corruption that you see being prosecuted usually entail a specific political enemy who becomes a scapegoat. And on the other hand, you see almost on a daily basis, what's left of the independent media talking about Segalmex, conflicts of interest in his own family, the dramatic increase in asignaciones directas, which are government contracts that are given to people. Giving someone a contract versus a public licitación, of course, is an opportunity for corruption. And then the reclassification of so much of what the government does as reserved or of national security means that we don't have access. And as you know, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So now we're operating in a context of very little sunlight, and I think probably more corruption and harder or less ways in which the citizens can intervene to correct that or combat it.
Okay, 2 more questions right here, Lou, and in the back there on the wall. Thank you.
I'm Lou Goodman from SIS, and Denise, thank you very much for your activism, your scholarship. People pay attention to you outside of Mexico and around the world. It's really, really important. And I so much appreciated your explanation of the dangers to democracy by the state and by the oligarchs. But Mexico has one of the largest black markets in the world, one of the most complex set of illegal industries. How does that complexify this?
And yes, there are some issues that I left out, such as I touched on violence. I didn't talk about drug trafficking, and I didn't talk about the U.S.-Mexico relationship and what has happened in this context. But as you know, López Obrador was elected because he promised a change in Mexico's security strategy, which had basically been the gradual ascent of the military taking over public security. And many people were dissatisfied with this because those of us who said that, and I'm not a specialist on this issue, but I'm members of the collective that I'm part of, that said from day one, do not use the military as a roving force for public security, because first of all, it doesn't work. Secondly, it takes away incentives to create a better police force, which is what Mexico needs. And third, you're going to have huge issues of violence and human rights violations. So those of the in the field, Catalina Perez Correa, Madrazo, Ernesto López Portillo, Dayan, who predicted this, were right. More military in charge of public security, more violence, more human rights violations. So the incoming president said, that's over. We're going to have abrazos en vez de balazos. I'm going to send the military back to the barracks. And what this translated into effectively was dismantling what was left of the federal police, creating the National Guard, which was supposed to be with a mando civil, with civilian control. And that's how the constitutional reform that he pushed through was approved. And I know that because I was there at the Senate the day it was voted. And our collective was like writing drafts of the law for the opposition. And it was going to be only for 5 years. And with all of the mandates that the Inter-American Commission, Human Rights Commission, says that have to be applied to the use of the military for public security, which is fiscalizado, a certain amount of time, exceptional. That all of those constraints were violated on day one when the president named a former military person to be in charge of the National Guard. So now you have a militarized National Guard, but a guard that is not necessarily deployed to protect the population, because the president doesn't want to be accused of being a repressor. So what happens? You have the military there as a deterrent. At times they confiscate drugs or engage in discrete battles with drug traffickers. But the end result has been the growing territorial capture and control of criminal gangs and drug organizations of Mexico throughout the country. So, and I'm not advocating that the military should have used force. I'm advocating that we should have had a different security strategy, and one that entailed professionalizing the police and legalizing a certain amount of the drug trade. I mean, what I'm saying is very politically incorrect, but it's true. Unless you look at paths towards legalization of, at the very least, marijuana, you are fighting the most functional market in the country. It's the market that does function. Others don't. This one does. Supply, demand, competition, lowest prices, etc. There's no way you can win that war. And the US has been largely responsible for us fighting that war. And just to end in terms of diplomacy and what this entails for the US-Mexico relationship, and this is something that I've argued also in foreign affairs. I mean, I understand why Biden has made the decisions he's made regarding immigration and the border, because he's vulnerable, because he's facing an election year, because this is his weak spot vis-a-vis Republicans, etc. But it's the devil's pact, you know? Protect the border, Mexico, accept all of these deportations, accept having a humanitarian crisis on the border, become de facto the third safe country, and we will zip it regarding democratic backsliding and the attacks on the INE and the judiciary and the militarization of Mexico. The problem is when, a couple of years down the line, when the US and Mexico try to re-engage over fentanyl or some other dramatic shared security issue, he's not going to be dealing with civilians. He's going to be dealing with the Mexican military. That military who, Cienfuegos, arrested by the DEA in Los Angeles and then returned through a high-level bilateral negotiation that that led to William Barr sending him back to Mexico to be tried, where he was tried and exonerated within a week and given a prize by the president yesterday. I mean, really, yesterday. So, you know what comes after it.
Okay,
Or we don't know, but it's, whatever it is, it's problematic.
our final question against the wall there.
Hernandez, and I am sitting here, in the graphic student here, and focus on the youth in Latin America. You mentioned that sense of youth of the, and we're going into, now that we've seen authoritarianism rising in South America, and as a very proud of Salvadorian immigrant military station and authoritarianism and a charismatic populist leader are all things we've already lived through sadly. How do we remind our fellow Paisanos that we've been here and that we already know what's going to happen in the end if we decide to go down this path?
Well, it's very hard. And it's
So the
basic.
question was about, how do we know how, is there a way to get out of this path?
No, and how do we remind people what it was
Right.
like to live under authoritarianism? Well, it's very hard to remind people if they didn't live through it. It's very hard to explain, even to my students, what it was like when there wasn't a credencial de elector, when there wasn't a reliable electoral roll call, when the PRI would bus people from place to place, when, you know, clientelism became a way of life for the PRI, and everything that entails in terms of democratic rights. I'd say, I mean, authoritarianism, some argue, oh, but it just makes the economy work better. At least, you know, López Obrador has been financially responsible. Well, I really question that in terms of the permanence of crony capitalism and the use of government resources to build infrastructure works that the government will probably have to subsidize, and you know, for whatever life there is left in the planet. And the military just got its own airline last week, Mexicana, which is offering tariffs of 12% below going commercial rate, which, as you know, and imagine what that entails for the commercial airlines of the country. And the only way in which this can be subsidized is by the Mexican government. So authoritarian governments, because decisions are made with such discretionality, tend to produce or end in economic crisis. And I think the only way in which we're going to be able to dislodge this kind of governance is when we face the next crisis. And there will be one. It will be in 6 months or 6 years, but because the numbers just don't work. The more problematic issue is, how do you dismantle the structure of mediation based on clientelist ties versus citizen empowerment? That is much, because you can get alternancia in terms of elections, but millions of people are receiving a check now from the government. And I have philosophically no issue whatsoever with creating social safety nets for the poor. I think that pensions for the elderly should have been an established public policy years ago. The problem is when that aid is distributed on a discretionary basis, and when you don't have the resources to pay for it in the long term because your economy isn't growing, or because of crony capitalism, you're not taxing the rich, or I mean, the so many other aspects that need to be put in place to guarantee everyone what should be universal basic income. So I think unless we suffer an internal or external shock, it is going to be very difficult to educate Mexicans about their rights or about the value of democracy. Where are my hopes? My hopes are in the people who marched with me in defense of the INE. My hopes are with the plural Mexico, because Mexico is a pluralistic country. My hopes lie with the feminists. I mean, the true movement that has been the opposition to López Obrador, it's been women. it's been women marching in the streets, because there's a confluence of the defense of individual rights, the defense of diversity, the defense of equality, and the critique of militarization, because it is so kind of the patrimonial state. And so the feminists have been the most active on the street, being gassed. You know, I've lived in Mexico all of my life. I've been to so many feminist marches. This is the first time where we marched and there were steel barriers around the National Palace. And the president was inside discrediting us and saying that we were all elitist or that the National Action Party was manipulating us, and then they gasped. So I hope that this talk has dispelled some of the myths surrounding this presidency. I hope that one of the takeaways is that you cannot describe this government as leftist. There is so much that it is doing that runs contrary to what the progressive left in Latin America is doing elsewhere. And I'd say militarization is one of the key issues that should create like a big, shocking red light in the middle of the leftist progressive narrative.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being with us today, and have a very nice